Trauma. It's everywhere around us. The more we meet and encounter people, particularly people who have issues, of course, the more we see it. And the astonishing thing is that it often pops out of people we would never have expected to be currently dealing with it, or quite possibly not quite managing to deal with it, in fact, but we never knew. Now, let's be clear what we mean by what is and what is not. It's not drama, it's trauma. In a particular sort of sense, trauma is a term used very widely to describe hurtful and see, this is just no good at all. I can't see through the pigging glasses. Oh, this isn't working at all. Okay. Trauma. It's everywhere around us. The more we meet and encounter people, particularly people who have issues, of course, the more we see it. And the astonishing thing is that it often pops out of people we would never have suspected to be currently dealing with it, or quite possibly not quite managing to deal with it. But we never knew. Now let's be clear what we mean by what it is and what it's not. It's not drama, it's trauma. In a practical sort of sense, trauma is a term used very widely to describe hurtful and challenging experiences and events that threaten and cause setbacks in our life. Trauma takes different forms to different people. Its origins can be as various as any group of traumatized people you care to consider. Maybe triggered by an unexpected calamity or some sort of abuse or a serious loss that confronts us and impacts us body, mind, and spirit. Always unpleasant. It can become overwhelming, can take up residence at the centre of our personality and affect our behaviours, how we think, choose, feel and respond. It's as varied as its causes and the people it affects. But all that having been said, there are clear and definite themes within that variety as to its roots, its effects and how to mend it. And those are what we're looking at today, from the example, the case study, of Jacob's son, Joseph. There were many people in the Old Testament who experienced trauma. The more you discover about trauma, the clearer that becomes. But Joseph's a great example to look at because of how he exhibits typical traits of trauma and how he wins through in the end. So much so that we read in the words of our Bible text today. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. And Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it's because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, it's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. That's Genesis 41 verses 50 to 52. So let's look first then at the experience of trauma Joseph had to overcome by the time he got to that verse we're looking at. Then let's look into Joseph's survival and recovery before trying to draw conclusions and applications for our own experience of either the need to overcome trauma we have known or to weatherproof ourselves against its not yet experienced predations. First of all, then, Joseph's experience of trauma that underlies the verse we've taken today. I think I identify 7 traumatic incidents and experiences in Joseph's life, up until a certain joyful and life-changing event, his response to which, in our verse, shows how he clearly won through it all. Trauma's weird like that. It can make you not enjoy or refuse to enjoy what should be an utterly joyful occurrence or experience. So when Joseph rejoiced at his experience, those 2 sons, we can see that he'd certainly been going through it, but that he'd equally surely come through it because of the way he rejoices in that happy event. Oh, look, we're going to get there, okay? Now, Joseph did have a special place in the affections of reasonably godly parents. He'd been the long-awaited child of Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel, and by the time he was a teenager, he was a communicative, confident, articulate young man. Now, naturally, of course, his other siblings saw him as brash and arrogant, and that's where it all started to go wrong for him. Let's look first then at Joseph's 7-fold experience of trauma. Firstly, it started with his mother's death. In Genesis 35, 16 to 18, the first trauma in Joseph's life comes along, and it comes along early to him. I imagine it was more common for this sort of thing to occur in those pre-medical days than it is in our time. But in Genesis 35, 16 to 18, we read that Joseph suffered the loss of his mother Rachel during the birth of Joseph's youngest brother, Benjamin. It happened while they were on the move from Bethel in the vicinity of what became Bethlehem. But whenever and wherever it happened, the young Joseph lost his mother. He was adored by his father. and no doubt by the ladies of the extended family, and the root of bitterness between him and his brothers began to develop out of that fact. He'd lost his mother. Secondly, there was his brother's death plot against him in Genesis 37:18-20. It's ironically the older people's response to Joseph's first trauma that seems to have given rise to his second trauma. He was his father's favourite son. Prancing about the place in the coat that his father Jacob had given to Joseph, the long-awaited son of his now-deceased favourite wife aroused the antagonism of his other brothers. I'm not going to get into the debate about whether it was a coat of many colours or, as some argue, a coat with long sleeves. The point is, it was a coat his brothers didn't have, but he did. And the antagonism became so intense that the other brothers began to abuse him and conspire to do away with him. Now, you've got to bear in mind, it's such a different culture to ours. It's a tribal, clan-based culture. And for his brothers to conspire to kill him was an aberrant violation of what was expected. So, in Genesis 37:18-20, as Joseph went out to see his brothers wearing that annoying coat, as they were out pasturing the flocks, they saw him coming and they conspired to kill him there and then. Absolutely traumatic to be in that situation. But there was to be a peculiar twist in the tale of the story, as the eldest brother, Reuben, intervened. Genesis 37:21-24. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So basically, there's a well out in the desert. And Reuben says, instead of killing him, just chuck him in the well. So Joseph's life was, you might think, initially spared, but in fact it wasn't as simple as that. Out there in the desert, they dropped him into a deep and narrow hole in the ground, a well. People died, still around the world they do die, from falling into wells, often slowly and unpleasantly. But the text says there was no water in the bottom of that well. That might sound like a mercy, but if you think it through, out there in the wilderness, out there in the desert, no water, that's a death sentence, isn't it? No water in a hole you can't get out of in a wilderness is a terrifying prospect. But hang on to that thought, because things are about to get a new sort of horrible for Joseph. Because thirdly, along comes a bunch of travelling traders. Genesis 37:25-8. As they were all out there together in the wilderness with Joseph in the well, the brothers saw a travelling trader's caravan approaching, and Judah came up with a bright idea. The upshot was that Joseph's brothers now rejected him completely by selling him into slavery at just 17 years of age. Genesis 37:25-28. We know this was traumatic to Joseph because years later his brothers confessed to it like this. They said to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why this distress has come on us." It's Genesis 42:21. So the young traumatized Joseph headed off towards life as a slave in the big evil city in Egypt. 17 years old. Taken to a foreign country where the foreign language you don't know, a foreign culture you don't understand, and foreign food you're certainly not used to. And in all likelihood, you're not being given much food anyway. And you've gone from being the favourite son of the head man of your tribe to being the chattel of some foreigner who doesn't love you. That's trauma 4 for Joseph. Now, it has to be said, God's got a plan, although a hidden one. And that's the trouble with trauma. So often we can't make sense of it. Doesn't mean there isn't sense going on behind the scenes somewhere where we can't see it. And that was definitely the case with the things going on for Joseph. And Joseph was a good-looking, a fairly wily lad, so he got on pretty well down in Egypt. He served usefully and well and ended up serving in the household of a man called Potiphar, a senior official of Pharaoh who was the top man in all of Egypt. But life is about to turn traumatic for Joseph again. Here's trauma number 5. Comes in the shape of Potiphar's wife. Genesis 39, 1-18. Potiphar's wife, of course, has become a bit of a legend, but not in a good way. Having done well using his personal gifts and natural appearance in Egypt, Joseph prospered and he became a trusted servant of this highly honoured man, highly placed in the government of Egypt. But a stark reminder not to rely on our natural abilities and gifts came to light in Joseph's traumatic experience with that man's wife. She saw the handsome young lad and she tried to seduce him, but he refused her on the basis that this wasn't proper. She tried to trap him. He escaped, but she grabbed his cloak as he escaped. And with the fury of a woman spurned, Potiphar's wife made a false allegation against Joseph, and he was jailed. It's all in Genesis 39. Some of you may have experience of this. You may realize it is awful to be subjected to false allegations. I listened to a man on this subject just this week. The poor guy has really been going through it. It's tough. So there was Joseph, traumatized by the false allegation of impropriety because of the place his natural attributes had got him to. Here comes trauma number 6, prison life. It's Genesis 39, 19 to 20. Trauma upon trauma, Joseph was thrown into hard prison. We read about it in Genesis, as I say, 39, 19 to 20. We also read about the effects of this on Joseph, though, in Psalm 105, 17 to 19, which reminds us how Joseph suffered there. It says, Joseph sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with shackles, his neck was put in irons, till what he foretold came to pass, till the word of the Lord proved him true. Bruised his feet with shackles, neck put in irons. Let's face it, that dark dungeon, described this way in the psalm, must surely have dragged up all the bad memories of that confined space that Joseph had been thrown into in the desert by his brothers, the dried up well trauma of his youth. And now here in this Egyptian dungeon, in the 6th experience of trauma that we identify in Joseph's life, he is in another hole. Now, weirdly, in that dungeon, he does have experience of companionship, the sort of thing people may look for relief from traumas under normal circumstances, a friend, you know. But just as preferment in Egypt, arising from his good looks and abilities, turned sour on him earlier, relying on companionship to mitigate his stress turns unpleasant on him too. Joseph is learning to tackle trauma God's way, and not simply by the things that mankind may choose to rely on exclusively. Instead, there he is in prison, trauma 6. But he makes friends in prison, and along comes trauma number 7 with that, because there's a butler there and a baker. And he does something great for the butler, but the butler then lets him down badly. So Joseph's in prison. He's enjoying a sympathetic hearing from his fellow prisoners as he talked. It's good to talk. Talked about his life's journey, Genesis 40, verse 15. With the butler and with the baker, who were imprisoned alongside him in the house of the captain of the guard, after Joseph was put in there following Potiphar's wife's false allegation. And again, in that unfortunate setting, Joseph used his natural gifts and talents, his likable personality, to win favour. He seems to have studied the ancient Eastern science, I suppose they called it, of dream interpretation, and interpreted the dreams had by the butler and the baker in Genesis 40 from verse 9 onwards. But he asked the butler that when the interpretation, the favourable interpretation of the butler's dream came true, and the butler was released and restored to his master's favour, the butler would speak out for Joseph about the injustice that Joseph had suffered. Now look, there's something you need to realise here. This culture that Joseph is in is a patronage culture, as it's called. It was one of the foundations of the way their society worked, that if someone did you a favour and then asked you for something because of that, you really were honour bound to meet the request when you were able to. And when that wasn't done, it was in that culture like the sky was falling in. It was an awful thing. There are cultures like that around the world today, where missionaries really need to take on board this cultural principle. Or you have to be careful, of course, about who you accept a favour from, because then you'll be beholden to them. So anyway, Joseph, when Joseph intervened to really help the butler, and when that man was rescued from prison, but in his newfound fortune forgot Joseph, that was much more than just a kick in the teeth, in ways that we from our culture might not appreciate. The blow was sort of life-shattering. It just served to intensify Joseph's previous traumas of betrayal, rejection, and imprisonment. Now that sort of thing could easily become the last straw that breaks a man. He's left languishing in prison, and the guy he's helped doesn't help him back. And in the goodness and the kindness of God to Joseph, that isn't the way it worked out, because the tide is about to turn for poor, embattled Joseph, 7 times traumatized Joseph. Let's look then more positively, more encouragingly, perhaps you might think, at Joseph's survival and recovery. I want to be absolutely clear about this fundamental principle. We cannot just cope or get over our experience of trauma. We may go through things that would traumatize other people, but that don't traumatize us. That is true. There was a man called Harry Parker on the Radio 4 Saturday Live programme, today, in fact, Saturday, who was an army captain blown up by an IED while serving in Afghanistan. He handles life now with powered prosthetics, and he's written a book called Hybrid Human, all about the use of technology that he makes to cope with his disability. But when asked, he was quite open about saying he never did have PTSD from his trauma experience. Trauma doesn't have to be traumatic. Trauma is when you lose a limb or something, I guess. But traumatic, he didn't have that. He had traumatic injuries, but they didn't traumatize him. Perhaps that's a better way to put it. Now look, PTSD is real, quite understandable, but it is not compulsory. It's things that we experience as traumatic that traumatize us. That's the issue. But my point is this. Once we have experienced something as a trauma, we need to, as they say, process that trauma of ours, or it will remain a wound to our heart, which will continue to affect us, the integrated body, mind, and spirit that constitutes us. Now, I'll give you an illustration, if I may. My paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, grew up in a large family of children in the docks area of Newport, and food wasn't apparently in fully abundant supply. And he ended up being brought back from the trenches in the Second World War, aged 14, for having lied about his age when he signed up. At 14, he'd witnessed the events and the effects of the human body of the things that were going on along the Western Front, and it was, by all accounts, horrendous. And then the following year, he was brought back again from the Somme, under arrest this time, for again having lied about his age, and he was returned to the UK. In his unit back over here, he so impressed the brigadier by his mastery of arms and his arms drill that he was allowed to go to Ireland to fight against the Easter Rising, led by people like Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Roger Casement, Eamon de Valera, and Michael Collins. Fought out amongst civilian populations. That was a messy and an ugly conflict. Now, my grandfather was actually a child, and he knew nothing of the politics, so, I guess we got to forgive him for that. But my point is that he saw many things that no child should ever see, and quite possibly did things that no child should ever do, because child he still technically was. And he never talked about it until the very last couple of years of his life, but I remember him from my childhood as cold. It's not a criticism. The man had a difficult and traumatic early life. My grandfather managed the trauma, I guess, really well, kept a lid on it, never spoke of it. And from the stories they told of their experiences, my father and uncle had what you might call a robust upbringing. My grandfather entered the police force, and I was told about him undertaking many feats of daring do during his service, risk-taking. So he rose to senior rank, but would still be seen with his baton in his hand, leading his men in street skirmishes outside the pubs of the industrial town where he was based, venting violence on Saturday nights. Only very much towards the end of his life did he, with personal pain all across his face, start to talk about some of his earlier traumatic experiences. You see, failing to process trauma can arise from ignorance or denial. I don't know which it was in my grandfather's case, and it may not be helpful to ask. It certainly wouldn't be helpful to attribute blame. That is really not appropriate at all. He was so much a victim of what he went through. The point is this, and it's crucial to Joseph. Once you've experienced stress, you need to process it, or you're going to pass it on. And that really, believe me, really is not a criticism that I'm offering. It's an observation on the constitution of human nature. You need to process it even when the tide seems to start to turn and things go better for you in life, because it can still be there, affecting your thoughts, your attitudes, your behaviors, and your conduct to other people. For Joseph, the tide does start to turn then. Genesis 41, 9-52. 2 years on after the final trauma we've looked at in Joseph's life, the butler remembered his friend Joseph, who was still in prison. Because Pharaoh, in whose presence the butler now stood, had had a dream that no one could interpret for him, and Pharaoh was frustrated by that, to put it mildly. Genesis 41, 1-8 explains the source of the frustration. Finally, the butler spoke up in that situation and recommended Joseph, still in prison, now to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh called for Joseph, who told this seemingly all-powerful ruler that his dream revealed what God was about to do to him and all of Egypt. 7 years of great harvest, 7 years of harsh famine. It's all in Genesis 41, 14-37. And Pharaoh gave Joseph a new beginning with great prospects and responsibility. New identity, new vocation, new citizenship, all came Joseph's way. But wait. Pharaoh also gave Joseph a beautiful Egyptian wife and an indigenous personalized name, which meant the God speaks and he, here meaning Joseph, lives. The God speaks and he lives. But there was more. During the 7 years of plenty, Joseph and his Egyptian wife had 2 sons, Genesis 41:50-52, the words of our verse, who they named Ephraim and Manasseh, of which more slightly later. Joseph's going to see his life brought to a place of restoration and relief from all his trauma, but let's see first how he came to arrive securely, safely, and healthily in that place. Basically, I want to show you how Joseph processed the stuff that had been going on for him. Firstly, of great significance seems to be intergenerational learning. First thing that jumps out at me here is this intergenerational learning thing. Joseph undoubtedly followed the example in life of his father Jacob. Jacob had endured a long and stressful set of setbacks after he fell in love with Joseph's mother, Rachel. The bride price for Rachel was to serve her father Laban for 7 years. Well, the bloke went for it. He wanted the girl. Jacob wanted Rachel, so he did the job. But when the 7 years were up, Laban tricked Jacob on the wedding day, and lifting the bride's veil after the wedding turned into a bit of a trauma when Jacob realized he'd married Rachel's sister, Leah. Jacob had to serve Laban another 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. So Rachel remained out of the picture while Leah had 4 boys, going on to have a total of 6 and a daughter. The last 3 offspring being born while Rachel was married to Jacob, but remained childless in Genesis 29:31 to, I guess, chapter 30, verse 21. And Rachel finally gave birth to Joseph, her firstborn, named him Joseph, meaning may God add prosperity, in Genesis 30:22 following. Jacob stayed on working with Laban in return for all the spotted sheep that were born. You know the story. And that infuriated Laban, so Joseph, his wives and flocks had to make away on their toes. But Jacob then made clear to his wives, while preparing for their departure, that they'd been threatened by their experiences, but that God had not allowed them to be harmed. Genesis 31. He also had God confirm the Lord's favour towards them to Jacob in a dream, and then God told Jacob to return to the land of his birth. It's in Genesis 31:10-13. And Jacob acted on these things faithfully under the protection of the faithful God. So here's the point. Jacob grew up in an oral culture with a strong tradition of storytelling, which passed on the wisdom of the clan to its next generation. So Joseph would have heard all the family stories being told as a youngster as he sat around the family fires at night eating his food. He'd have had it ingrained in him how Abraham, Isaac, and his father Jacob had been visited, led, tested by, and covenanted with by God. How that protected his people's path through life towards the future blessing that the Almighty had promised to Joseph's people. So Joseph grew up against the background of a bigger picture. That's really important. A bigger picture that would help him in making sense through all this trauma of where his future lay. And many years later, when he seemed to experience trauma, Joseph believed the words that he'd heard from his father, words of reassurance, that because of God's word to Joseph's family, God would not allow any actual harm to frustrate God's plan for the very much bigger picture. Having that sense of the bigger picture can be really, really important in dealing with the experience of trauma. The third thing that helped was guarding what defined him. This in its turn helped Joseph a great deal. And having that big picture, of course, helped Joseph to guard what defined him because he had a place in the big picture. Joseph did not deny the traumatic things that happened to him. But neither did Joseph develop a victim mentality and allow all those bad things to define who he was. John Stewart writes this of Joseph and trauma recovery in Tackling Trauma, a book edited by Paul Barker. It's Langham, 2019. Stewart says this: for each day of his traumatic experiences, Joseph made conscious responses, and these became a kind of antidote to his pain. For each day of his traumatic experience, Joseph made conscious responses. Thought, right, I'm going to do this. And these became a kind of antidote to his pain, to the poison of it. Joseph kept his love alive throughout this time of being in exile in Egypt. kept his love alive for his faraway father. Joseph did not indulge his hurt in bitterness towards his brothers who'd got him there. Joseph honoured God in all his decisions, fled temptation, stayed generous, strong and patient. Yes, he remained in what he would call in Genesis 41:52, the land of my affliction. He remained there. But he didn't dwell on being a victim there, but got on down to things and got on with whatever it was God was doing by keeping him there. And that's a very resilient response that he's deliberately making. Now we're merging into the next feature of Joseph's response, which was that he refused to be a hostage to his pain. Joseph seems to have sought healing rather than seeking solace in nurturing his pain. And that's a very easy thing to do, to seek solace in nurturing your pain. Let's try to make sure you take me for what I mean here rather than something I don't. Let's come at it like this. Joseph was an habitually chatty bloke. He didn't treat his experiences as private pains to hoard and nurture. You can reckon each time Joseph talked about his pain to someone else, the pain he was feeling got lessened a bit. If you're a bloke like me, the thought of talking about your troubles sounds dreadful. You don't want to go there. Of course, in my work, I've developed the practice of being chatty, but I have to really push myself when I know I need to talk about some trouble or other. But we read of Joseph telling his troubles to other people. Now, the skeptics among us who really don't want to do this themselves will surely say if he'd been working for Joseph, it'd have helped him out. Well, it was working for Joseph. That's a great point. Funnily enough, in our text today, we see Joseph and Asenath, his wife, naming their children. They named their first child Manasseh, which means forget, and their second child Ephraim, which means to be fruitful. So when in years to come the kids asked about their names, Joseph could say to Manasseh, I've chosen to live my life without carrying heavy baggage, so I've forgotten the trauma, though perhaps not the experiences of my past. Then to the same question from Ephraim, what's my name mean? Old Joseph could reply about the promises God gave him years before, that in spite of every hard thing that had happened to him, Joseph and his family line were going to be fruitful. Joseph wouldn't accept being chained to a painful past, but let go his bitterness to live with hope for the future, the hope that God had given him to live in. And here's an interesting side note right here. Trauma tends to blind us to the good things of the present and bind us to the past, making it difficult for us to live in the present. You can't live now if you're preoccupied with your painful past. But Hebrews, funnily enough, paints for us the forward-looking nature of Joseph's faith. It says, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. He's looking forward to that future time of the exodus. You can read about it in Hebrews 11:22. Okay, it was going to be 430 years before Joseph's bones would be taken to be reburied in the land of his ancestors. Genesis 50 and Exodus 12 talk about it. But Joseph lived with that forward-looking focus. Yeah, we need to accept the burden of our past, but to do so looking forward to what Romans 8:18 describes as the glory that will be revealed in us. And perhaps that's what enabled Joseph to do this next thing. The fifth positive strategy that he had was dealing with and processing his trauma, seeking to forgive. Seeking to forgive. Joseph didn't return evil for evil, but good for it. Amazingly, obviously, when dealing incognito with his grain-begging brothers, whilst not ignoring what had happened to him and probing his brothers' guilt and repentance, Joseph, in a position of power, did not hold grudges and never sought revenge. Interestingly, the word forgive is first used in the Bible in Genesis 50, verse 17, by Joseph's brothers. And by verse 19, Joseph is telling them to have no fear. His words are revealing of other ways he'd handled his trauma, ways that we've examined already. Hear these words. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? That is to judge them and punish them. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. That's Genesis 50, 19 to 21. Through all the bitter experiences of his life, Joseph had held on to his faith in his God and the bigger picture that came with his faithfulness from the history of his family's dealing with the Lord and God's promising to them. He lived in the light of that. And yet, nevertheless, As he processed his grief by these means, as an integral part of that, Joseph nonetheless mourned over his trauma. The final way he sets about dealing with and processing his trauma is by lament. You see, several times Genesis frankly tells us outright that Joseph wept. You can check it in Genesis 42:24, Genesis 43:30, Genesis 45:14, Genesis 46:29, Genesis 50 verse 1. I tell you those references just so you realize how common a thing it is. Stewart again says, as an adult, he had learned the need for and the value of open and appropriate expression of emotions. The value of it. Now, he had to work to hide his tears from his brothers in Egypt not to give the game away, but he nonetheless shed those tears, and his farewell to his father involved 70 days of mourning in Egypt and full 7 days of it away in the land of Canaan. So Stewart concludes the matter. Joseph felt pain and learned to express it freely in a healthy way. Of course, painful memories return. One painful experience can bring others to the fore of your mind again. Memories of past traumas resurface. We begin to grieve the old loss once more. And processing pain is that. A process, not just an event. And as painful memories return, we need to grieve again. But it's a process. And each time we grieve, the pain diminishes. And telling our stories lessens the sting of our trauma. Mourning, lamenting, can be a God-given gift to us as imperfect people in an imperfect world. And our expressions of deep feelings of loss help us to process our pain and prevent further harm occurring to ourselves and to others near us. Look, we've been long enough. Let's come to an application. What can we learn from this for ourselves? Well, yes, Joseph was a sufferer. But the way he handled it meant that Joseph was a survivor. Not always a nice one, which sometimes gave rise to him, was sometimes bound up with his suffering. That's just reality. But whilst he suffered, he also survived, settled and served in Egypt for 80 years, living by faith in the promise of his God. And here's the thing. His traumatic experiences neither defined, destroyed, nor even just inhibited him, because, as he said in our text, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Genesis 41:52. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. I really do commend that to you as a verse to commit to memory. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Joseph became like a fruitful tree planted beside a watercourse, as Psalm 1:3 puts it, bearing fruit in the right season, not because he was coddled in a specialist garden, not because he never knew grief, pain and threats, but because he tended to the needs of his tree. And because he chose that course of life, rather than neglecting his tree's needs. Whatever it is you're dealing with or that you're going to be dealing with, I hope the example of Joseph, go back over it, puts things in the toolbox that enables you and me to deal with the traumas that can arise in life, to process them into fruitful life and experience. God bless you.